Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger there is. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 447. Gate 22 at Denver International smelled like burnt coffee and jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. Flight 447 to Chicago was boarding in 20 minutes, and the gate area was packed the way gate areas always are. On a Friday, tired business travelers, a family with 3 kids fighting over a tablet, a woman in scrubs asleep sitting up. David Reyes stood near the window, watching a 737 push back from the neighboring gate. He was 51 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life lifting things heavier than himself, with gray creeping into a close-cropped beard. His jumpsuit was navy blue, faded at the knees, with a name patch stitched crooked over the chest pocket, Reyes, and a streak of hydraulic fluid on the left forearm that hadn't fully come out in the wash. He carried a single duffel bag and a paperback novel with a cracked spine. He'd been up since 3 in the morning, elbow deep in a landing gear assembly at a regional maintenance hangar outside Denver, and he was flying standby, hoping to make it home to Chicago in time for his daughter's college orientation dinner. He hadn't had time to change. 12 feet away, Roger Callahan checked his Patek Philippe for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Roger was the kind of man who introduced himself by his job title before his name, Senior Vice President Callahan Capital Partners, and who had upgraded to first class so automatically it hadn't occurred to him it was a choice. He glanced at David, then glanced away the way people do when they've already decided someone isn't worth a second look. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin boarding Flight 447 to Chicago. First class and priority members, please have your boarding passes ready. Roger stepped forward immediately, flashing his pass without breaking stride. Behind him, an agent scanned David's ticket, a last-minute upgrade Seat 2C, courtesy of a maintenance crew travel voucher he'd earned after 18 years with the airline's contracted ground services. Seat 2C, the agent said. Enjoy your flight, sir. Roger, 3 feet ahead in the jet bridge, turned at the words and did a visible double take. First class. This man. He said nothing yet, but his jaw set in a way that suggested he was already composing a complaint in his head. Inside the cabin, flight attendant Denise Marlowe greeted each passenger with the practiced warmth of someone 12 years into the job. She recognized David's uniform patch, not from her airline, but close enough in style that she assumed correctly he worked ground operations somewhere. "Welcome aboard," she said. 2C is right here on your left. David settled into the window seat, tucking his duffel under the seat in front of him with the careful economy of a man used to small spaces. He pulled out his paperback. 2 rows up, Roger was already speaking low and irritated to the passenger beside him, loud enough to carry. "Guess anybody can buy a seat up here now," Roger said, not quite under his breath. "They really let maintenance crew sit in first class these days." The passenger beside him, a young woman with headphones half in, gave a non-committal shrug and put the other earbud in. David heard it. He always heard it. He'd heard some version of it in airports for 20 years, the assumption written across a stranger's face before a single word was exchanged. He didn't look up from his book. He'd learned a long time ago that the loudest reaction wasn't always the strongest one. Denise, moving down the aisle with a tray of pre-departure drinks, caught the tail end of Roger's comment and felt her stomach tighten. She'd worked enough flights to know where that kind of talk usually went. She offered David a water first, out of some instinct to counter the moment with a small kindness, and he thanked her by name off her badge. "Thank you, Denise," in a voice calm enough that she almost forgot what she'd just overheard. The cabin door closed. The safety briefing played. The Boeing 737 pushed back into the gray Denver evening rain, just beginning to fleck the windows, and Flight 447 began to taxi toward the runway. Neither of its 2 central passengers yet knew would define the next 2 hours of their lives. The climb out was smooth. Denise moved through the cabin with the meal service, and Roger made a point twice of asking loudly whether regular passengers got the same entree options as everyone else, a question with no real content except the message underneath it. David ate his chicken in silence, reading his novel, seemingly unbothered. But David wasn't unbothered. He was watching. He noticed the flight attendant's body language shift almost imperceptibly whenever they walked past row 2, a fraction more tension in the shoulders, a fraction faster pace. He noticed the first officer step out of the cockpit once, exchange a few clipped words with the lead flight attendant, and step back in with a face that had gone very still. He noticed 20 minutes later when the plane hit a patch of turbulence that felt just slightly wrong, not the rhythmic bump of weather, but a single sharp shudder that ran through the floor and up through the armrests. The seatbelt sign chimed on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're seeing some indications on our right engine that we want to take a closer look at. Nothing to be alarmed about. We're going to level off and run some checks. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. The calm, practiced tone of an airline captain is a specific kind of performance, and most passengers accepted it at face value. But David had spent 18 years around engines, exactly like the ones bolted to this aircraft. He heard the pitch change in the right side engine, subtle, almost nothing, a half-second irregularity in the whine. Most people wouldn't register as anything but background noise. He closed his book. Roger, 2 rows up, had gone pale and gripped his armrest. What was that? What was that sound? Denise moved quickly down the aisle, reassuring passengers row by row, her voice even, despite the fact that her own pulse was climbing. When she reached row 2, David caught her eye and asked quietly, so as not to alarm anyone around him, "Compressor stall or something in the bleed air system?" Denise blinked. It wasn't the question of a nervous passenger, it was the question of someone who knew exactly what a shudder like that could mean. I'm not sure," she said honestly. "The flight deck hasn't said." "Can you get a message to the captain?" David said, still calm, still quiet, "and ask if the right engine's EGT spiked before the shudder or if it was steady and then dropped. It matters which." Denise hesitated only a second before deciding that any information was better than none in a moment like this. She moved to the intercom near the galley and relayed the question to the cockpit through the interphone. In the cockpit, Captain Elena Ruiz and First Officer Tom Whitfield were running through their engine-out checklist with the particular focus of 2 professionals doing exactly what their training demanded, betraying nothing to each other but the occasional clipped exchange. The right engine's exhaust gas temperature had indeed spiked briefly before settling into an unusual pattern, not a full failure, but not normal either. It was the kind of ambiguous reading that could mean a dozen different things, some benign, some very much not. "Tell whoever's asking," Ruiz said without looking up from her instruments. "It spiked, then dropped and stabilized low. We're diverting to Kansas City as a precaution." Denise relayed the answer back to David. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "That's not a compressor stall," David murmured mostly to himself. "That's a fuel control issue. If the EGT spiked, and then the readings dropped low and stayed low, the engine might be running lean, starved, not damaged. If they shut it down as a precaution, and it's actually a stuck fuel valve, they need to know before they try a restart on approach, or they could lose engine response, exactly when they need it most." Denise stared at him. "How do you know that?" David looked at her for the first time with something other than mild patience. "Because I've spent 18 years fixing exactly this engine type. Denise, can you get the captain a message from me? Not a passenger. Tell her, check FADEC fault code before any restart attempt. If it's a fuel metering fault, don't cycle the ignition without isolating the valve first." Roger, straining to listen from 2 rows up, scoffed loud enough to be heard across the cabin. "Oh, for God's sake. The janitor's giving flight instructions now?" Several passengers turned. David didn't turn at all. "I'm not a janitor," he said simply, still looking at Denise. "But that's not the important part right now." Denise had exactly one choice to make in about 4 seconds, and she made it. She'd been flying long enough to know that pride had no business in a cockpit conversation when lives were on the line, and something about the specificity of David's words, FADEC fuel metering fault, isolating the valve, told her this wasn't a passenger performing confidence. This was someone speaking a language she'd only heard maintenance crews use during ground delays. She moved to the interphone. "Captain, I have a passenger in 2C. He says he's aviation maintenance, 18 years on this engine type. He's asking you to check the FADEC fault code before any restart, and if it's a fuel metering fault, not to cycle ignition without isolating the valve first." There was a pause on the line. In the cockpit, Ruiz and Whitfield exchanged a glance. "Ask his name and credentials," Ruiz said. Denise returned to row 2. "Captain wants to know your name and your background. She needs something to go on." David set his book down fully now, and for the first time something in his posture changed. Not defensive, but settled, like a man stepping into work he knew better than anything else in his life. "David Reyes, master-level airframe and power plant mechanic, licensed since 2008. Before that, 12 years in the Air Force, crew chief on C-17s, then squadron maintenance for a fighter wing. I spent 4 years specifically certified on this engine family before I ever touched a civilian aircraft. Tell her that." Denise relayed it word for word. In the cockpit, Whitfield pulled up the maintenance log on the aircraft's tablet system, cross-referencing the tail number's engine records purely out of habit, and froze for half a second at what populated on the screen. A service bulletin flagged 8 months earlier, related to exactly the fuel metering component David had named on this specific engine family that many operators had been slow to complete. Ruiz didn't hesitate long. Whether the man was right or not, The information cost nothing to verify and everything to ignore. "Check the FADEC fault log," she told Whitfield. 30 seconds later, Whitfield's voice was tight. "Captain, fault code confirms a fuel metering unit deviation." It's exactly what he said. The cabin, meanwhile, had grown tense in the particular way cabins do when passengers sense something is wrong but don't yet know what. Roger had stopped complaining and started praying quietly, hands folded, forgetting entirely about the man in the jumpsuit 3 rows behind, whom he'd mocked 20 minutes earlier. A child 2 rows back was crying. Denise moved through the cabin, reassuring people with the calm, rehearsed cadence of her training, even as her mind stayed locked on the conversation happening at row 2. Back in the cockpit, Ruiz keyed the interphone directly to David's row for the first time, an almost unheard-of breach of standard procedure, but these were not standard circumstances. "Mr. Reyes, this is Captain Ruiz. I appreciate the information. We're proceeding with a precautionary single-engine approach into Kansas City. I want to isolate the fuel valve per your recommendation before attempting any restart. Is there anything else from where you sit that we should know?" David spoke clearly enough for Denise standing beside him to relay every word precisely. "2 things, Captain. First, if this is the same service bulletin I think it is, the fuel valve has a tendency to bind partially closed under vibration, not fully closed. That means you may have partial thrust available even without a restart, which could matter for your approach speed calculations. Second, don't rush the checklist because of the passengers. I've watched good crews make bad decisions under pressure from people who don't understand what they're looking at. You have time. Use it." There was a beat of silence on the line. "Copy that, Mr. Reyes," Ruiz said. "And thank you." Word travels fast in a pressurized metal tube at 35,000 feet, even without anyone announcing anything. Passengers in the rows around David had caught enough fragments, Air Force, crew chief, 18 years, fault code confirms, to piece together that the man in the stained jumpsuit was not who anyone had assumed. Roger, 3 rows up, had gone very quiet. He kept glancing back, his expression shifting between disbelief and something that looked uncomfortably like shame, though he wasn't ready to name it that yet. Denise, still standing near row 2 in case the cockpit needed anything further, found herself studying David with new eyes. "Crew chief," she said, "on C-17s. That's a big aircraft to be responsible for." David gave a small, tired smile, the first real smile he'd shown since boarding. "Bigger than this one. We used to move Humvees and howitzers out of forward bases in weather you wouldn't fly a paper airplane in. You learn to trust your training because there's no tower for 1,000 miles some nights." "And after the Air Force?" "Went civilian. Got my A&P license, worked my way up. Now I run overnight maintenance checks for regional carriers out of Denver. Nobody glamorous. I just fix what's broken so the next crew doesn't find out about it at 35,000 feet. He paused, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "Guess tonight I found out anyway." An older man across the aisle who'd been listening quietly leaned over. "Son, why didn't you say something when that fella up front was running his mouth?" David considered the question honestly. Didn't seem worth it. People believe what they want to believe about a stained jumpsuit. I've been doing this job long enough to know the work speaks louder than the uniform does, eventually. Usually just takes the right moment. 2 rows up, Roger unbuckled his seatbelt against the still-lit sign, walked back 3 rows, and stood in the aisle beside seat 2C, looking for the first time all evening, genuinely uncertain of himself. "Mr. Reyes," Roger said, his voice smaller than it had been all flight. "I owe you an apology. What I said back at the gate in the cabin, that was out of line. I judged you before I knew a single thing about you, and I was wrong, badly wrong." David studied him for a moment, not with satisfaction, but with the plain patience of a man who'd absorbed this exact moment more times than he could count, and had long since stopped needing the apology to feel whole. "Appreciate you saying that," David said. "Sit down, though. Sign's still on, and I'd rather you not become the next thing I have to worry about tonight." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearby rows, the first real release of tension since the shudder in the engine. Roger, chastened, returned to his seat, but not before pausing at row 2 one more time. "For what it's worth," Roger added, "whatever you're paid at that maintenance job, it's not enough." David didn't answer that. He'd heard enough compliments built on guilt to know they rarely meant much. What mattered right now was the plane and the 91 other people on it. The descent into Kansas City International began 40 minutes later. The cabin lights dimmed, per procedure, the cockpit crew working through a single-engine approach checklist, with the deliberate calm of professionals who had, for the first time in the flight, real information, instead of ambiguous warning lights. Ruiz had followed David's guidance precisely, isolating the fuel valve rather than attempting a restart, recalculating approach speeds to account for partial residual thrust rather than assuming a total loss, briefing the cabin crew on the adjusted procedure with enough clarity that Denise could walk the aisle, explaining in plain terms exactly what passengers should expect. Fear, David had told her earlier, shrinks considerably once people understand what's actually happening. She'd repeated that thought to herself twice already. David sat with his hands folded, watching the wing lights blink against the darkening approach into Kansas City, feeling the particular quiet focus that came from a job partially done and partially out of his hands now. He'd given the crew what he could. The rest belonged to Ruiz and Whitfield, and he trusted them. He'd trained pilots himself years ago on emergency procedures for exactly this kind of scenario, and he recognized competence when he heard it in a voice over an interphone. The landing gear extended with its familiar rumble. The runway lights of Kansas City rose up through the rain-streaked windows, red and white, steady and real. The 737 touched down with a firm, controlled thump, not the smoothest landing David had felt, but a competent one, exactly the kind you wanted from a crew managing an emergency approach on limited thrust. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause the moment the wheels settled and the reverse thrust kicked in. Passengers who'd spent the last 40 minutes gripping armrests in silence let out a collective breath. Somewhere near the back, someone was crying with relief. The child who'd been crying earlier was now laughing at her mother's exaggerated cheer. As the plane taxied to the gate, the interphone crackled once more. "Mr. Reyes," Captain Ruiz's voice came through. "This is Elena Ruiz. On behalf of myself, First Officer Whitfield, and everyone in this cabin, thank you. I'd like to meet you at the gate if you have a few minutes. I think a few people would like to shake your hand." David allowed himself finally a full smile. "I've got time, Captain. My connection's probably gone anyway." At the gate, ground crew and airline staff had gathered in a loose, curious cluster, word having traveled ahead through dispatch about the maintenance emergency and the passenger who'd talked the crew through it in real time. Captain Ruiz stepped out of the cockpit first, still in uniform, and extended her hand to David before he'd fully stood from his seat. 18 years fixing this exact engine, and you just happen to be sitting in 2C tonight, she said, shaking her head slightly. "I don't believe in luck like that. I believe in the universe having a strange sense of timing." "Wasn't luck," David said. "Just happened to be the guy who needed to fly home for his daughter's orientation dinner tonight." "Well," Ruiz said, "you may have gotten her there a little late, but you got 91 other people there at all. I'd call that a fair trade." Denise, standing nearby, handed David a small card, her direct contact information. "If you're ever looking to consult, or if this airline's smart enough to hire you outright, I want the credit for the introduction." Roger lingered at the edge of the gathering, and when the small crowd finally thinned, he approached one more time, quieter now than at any point during the flight. "I run a private aviation consulting fund," he said. "We work with several regional carriers on maintenance and safety compliance. I know that's not why you did any of this, but if you're ever interested in a role that pays what your knowledge is actually worth, call me. No strings. I owe you that much at minimum." David took the card, considered it, and slid it into his jumpsuit pocket next to a worn set of work gloves. "I'll think about it," he said honestly. "Right now I've got a dinner to get to, if I can find a rental car in the next hour." He shouldered his duffel bag, tucked his paperback under his arm, and walked toward the terminal exit, still in the same stained jumpsuit he'd boarded in. Still, just a man trying to make it home to his daughter. Except now, the entire concourse behind him understood exactly what that jumpsuit had never stopped meaning. "I've flown with captains who trained for 20 years and still froze under pressure, and I've sat 3 rows behind men in work clothes who could have talked any one of them through the worst night of their career. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not the uniform, that truly separates us. If this story moved you, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next flight."